Notice what's missing from all three of these. None of them are a job in the conventional sense. None of them pay by the hour, the day, or even reliably by the year. Land, lending, and patronage all share one trait. The income detaches from the time Seneca personally spent generating it. That detachment is the entire definition of wealth versus income, and Rome built an entire legal structure around making sure its elite class lived on the wealth side of that line. Here's where this stops being ancient history trivia and becomes something you can actually use. The mechanism that separated Seneca from a wage earner in his own time is the exact same mechanism that separates an owner from an employee today. Convert labor into an asset as early as possible. A skill becomes an asset when you stop selling it by the hour and start packaging it into something repeatable, something that earns whether or not you personally show up that day. A course built once and sold indefinitely. A process documented once and run by someone else. A piece of writing or work that keeps generating value long after the hours spent creating it have ended. Capital becomes an asset the moment it's deployed somewhere it generates a return without your daily involvement, whether that's a rental property collecting rent the way Seneca's estates collected grain and oil, or money invested at interest the way his loans generated income regardless of what he did with his afternoons. Even relationships and reputation function like Seneca's patronage income, value that compounds quietly in the background until it pays out, often disproportionate to the hours that built it, the way one well-placed introduction or one piece of trust earned years earlier can produce an opportunity worth more than months of direct labor. But here's where most modern wealth content stops, and where the actual Stoic philosophy goes somewhere different. Almost every version of this story you'll find online treats the accumulation itself as the entire point. Build the asset, multiply the asset, never stop building. Seneca didn't see it that way, and his own writing is explicit about why. In his letters to his friend Lucilius, Seneca draws a constant distinction between Negotium, meaning business, active public obligation, the demands of running an estate or sitting in the Senate, and Otium, a word that gets badly translated as simply leisure, but really means structured, examined time, the space required to actually think, write, and live according to reason instead of obligation. He returns to this distinction repeatedly across the letters, often describing specific friends and colleagues who never managed to make the shift, men who kept postponing the examined life for one more year of business, one more profitable deal, one more rung of status, until old age or death arrived before the postponed life ever began. For Seneca, the entire purpose of building wealth that didn't require his hourly labor wasn't to accumulate more of it forever, it was to eventually buy enough otium to stop. And he wrote about that goal with more clarity and urgency the older he got, as if he could feel the window for actually using it narrowing. And he actually tried. In the year 62, with Nero's reign growing increasingly unstable and dangerous, and two of Seneca's strongest allies at court recently dead, Seneca formally went to Nero and offered to hand back the bulk of his fortune, the estates, the accumulated gifts, all of it in exchange for permission to withdraw completely from public life. The Roman historian Tacitus records the conversation in detail, including Seneca's own reasoning that he had reached an age and an amount of wealth where continuing to hold both invited nothing but envy and risk, and that returning what he could no longer enjoy in peace was the wiser course. He had built land, lending income, and political capital for decades, and when he reached what he judged to be enough, he tried to cash out and walk away cleanly. Nero refused the offer, reportedly with warm words and reassurances that masked a political reality underneath, that Seneca's presence and his association with the throne were still useful, and useful people are rarely permitted to simply leave. His position and a significant portion of his wealth kept him entangled in the palace politics he was trying to escape. This is the part of the story almost nobody tells, and it's the most important part for anyone actually trying to build wealth instead of just admiring the idea of it. 3 years after that refused retirement, in the year 65, Seneca was implicated, likely falsely, in a conspiracy against Nero and was ordered to take his own life. The wealth that detached his income from his hours never fully detached him from the political structure that produced it. He built the asset side of the ledger brilliantly across land, lending, and patronage, three completely independent income streams that most people today would consider a genuinely sophisticated portfolio, even by modern standards. He never fully built the exit, and 3 years is not a long runway between asking to leave and being killed by the very system you were trying to step away from. That's the real lesson buried under Seneca never worked for money. It's not just that he found a way to make income without trading hours for it, although he did, through land, lending, and patronage, none of which depended on a wage, all of which were structurally available to him before he was even old enough to understand what they were. The deeper lesson is that he understood, decades before he tried to act on it, that wealth without a defined exit point is just a more comfortable version of the same trap he'd spent a lifetime writing about avoiding. He wrote about the danger of endless accumulation more clearly than almost anyone in his era, with more precision and more conviction than most modern finance writers manage, and he still waited too long to actually use his own wealth to leave. So, here are the 3 principles worth pulling out of this, stated plainly enough to actually apply.
First, convert your labor into an asset as early as you possibly can, even in a small way. The moment a skill, a relationship, or a piece of capital starts producing value independent of the hours you personally spend it on it that week, you've crossed from the wage side of the line to the ownership side, the same line Roman law drew around the senatorial class. You don't need 3 separate income structures like Seneca had. You need at least one thing that pays you while you're not actively working it, and it doesn't need to start large. The senators who built the biggest estates in Roman history all started with a single inherited field. What matters is the direction of the structure, not the size of it on day one. Second, define what the asset is actually for before you build it. Seneca was explicit that the entire point of capital was to purchase Otium, time freed up for a more deliberate life, not simply a bigger pile of land or a longer list of debtors. If you build wealth without ever deciding what it's supposed to buy you back in time, freedom, or peace, you'll keep building past the point of diminishing returns simply because building is the only mode you know how to operate in, the same way some of Seneca's own colleagues kept expanding their estates and their lending portfolios well past any reasonable definition of enough, with no goal in mind beyond the next acquisition. Third, set the exit criteria before you're under pressure to set them. Seneca tried to negotiate his retirement at a moment of political danger, when leverage was already against him, asking to leave only after the warning signs at court had become impossible to ignore. The lesson isn't subtle. Decide now, while things are calm, what amount, what milestone, what specific signal will tell you it's time to actually use the wealth you're building, rather than continuing to accumulate it indefinitely. Waiting until circumstances force the question, the way Nero's instability eventually forced Seneca's hand, means making that decision from a position of weakness instead of strength, negotiating from need rather than from a calm, pre-decided plan you simply execute when the number is hit. There's a strange kind of comfort in knowing that even a man this disciplined, this clear-eyed about the difference between wages and ownership, still got the timing of his own exit wrong. It means the principle itself was sound. Land, lending, and position over labor, building assets that detach income from hours, all of it worked exactly as intended, for decades, without fail. What he underestimated wasn't the wealth-building mechanism, it was how much harder it is to walk away from a system once you're valuable to the people running it, which is a warning worth sitting with regardless of which century you're building wealth in. The richer and more useful you become, the more resistance you'll face the moment you try to actually cash in the freedom that wealth was supposed to buy you, and that resistance rarely comes labeled as resistance. It usually arrives the way it did for Seneca, dressed up as flattery and reassurance. If this changed how you think about the difference between earning and owning, subscribe, because the next video picks up exactly where this one leaves off. Building the asset side of the ledger, the way Seneca did across land, lending, and patronage, turns out to be the easier half of the problem. Knowing when you've built enough and actually having the discipline to stop is the part almost nobody gets right on the first attempt, Seneca included. The next video looks at the specific test he reportedly used on himself to check whether he'd actually become too attached to everything he'd spent decades building, and whether that test would have caught the trap before it caught him if he'd run it earlier than he did.